Welcome back to Firmer Ground from SRM, where we explore trends and strategies impacting the current and future state of financial institutions in North America and across the globe. This is Neil Dougherty, host of today's podcast and Managing Director of Global Marketing at SRM. Every episode features perspectives from the world of banking and financial services, including thought leaders here at SRM, executives at financial institutions far and wide, and experts from all corners of the industry. In this episode, I speak with Steven Findley. Gary is a respected legal, economic, and management authority in the banking industry. He represents the Findley Companies, consisting of the Steven Findley and Associates law firm specializing in regulatory and merger and acquisition law for financial institutions, the Findley Reports, a banking publication informing directors and senior managers of notable trends in the industry, and the Findley Group, the consulting arm that specializes in strategic development, management analysis, and regulatory compliance for banks. Gary is also on the California Community Banking Network Board of Directors, an entity SRM supports as a preferred services partner. Gary is an outspoken advocate for the independent banking community in California, and in this conversation we cover a whole range of topics, starting with Gary's banking backstory, his thoughts on the choppy banking waters of 2023, and his outlook for the days and years to come for independent banks in California and beyond. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Gary Findley. Well, hi, everyone. Neil Dougherty here, Managing Director of Global Marketing at SRM, and my guest in the podcast studio today is Steven Findley, Principal at the Findley Companies and a trusted attorney and advisor to the banking industry in California. Gary is also a board member of the California Community Banking Network and has been deeply ingrained in the banking culture of the state for 50 plus years. And I'm thrilled to have him on the SRM Firmer Ground podcast today to discuss his background, the challenges facing independent banks today, and what moves will help community banks continue their growth well into the future. So welcome, Gary, and thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Great to have you. Well, we've chatted before, and I was hoping just for our listeners' sake, you could share a little bit about your background. I know you told me that you've been involved in banking in some way, shape, or form in California for more than 50 years. So tell us a little bit about that. How did that come about? And talk to us a little bit about your banking backstory, if you will.
Sure, appreciate it, Neil. The Findleys have been involved in banking since the early 1950s. My father, who was a World War II vet, went to UCLA and graduated with a master's in banking and finance back in that time. You never hear that degree at this time.
Right.
And was a bank consultant, went to work at Union Bank in the early 50s, which was a major correspondent bank in the California area. And one of their roles and responsibilities was to go out and organize banking institutions so they would create their own clientele in these communities. And he did a lot of that in the 50s. And in the late 50s, he decided to start out on his own and created the Findley Companies and Jerry Findley Incorporated. And so I have grown up in the banking industry. In fact, my father's office was actually in our family home. And it was actually in our garage. He had a secretary there, and he had his office there. And
so he was a pioneer for working from home. Is that what you're telling us, Gary?
He was a pioneer from working from home, but it was great in the sense he could spend a lot of time and
Sure.
support us in all of our different endeavors. But since the family business was in the home, we all grew up in the business. And so, when I was 9 years old, I was going to bank board meetings. I was spreading call reports or financial statements. It says in my early teens, doing feasibility studies, which were required at that time, it says to establish branches or new banks, and working with my father on various different applications that would be submitted to the various different regulatory agencies. And we always kind of knew that I was going to move into this area. My father was not an attorney; he was a bank consultant, and so when I went out of high school into college, I went to Occidental and I majored in economics. And my senior thesis was the business plan and viability study for the organization of a national bank, which was Far East National Bank in Los Angeles, California. And so you can think about, a 20-year-old basically writing the business plan of a bank that got submitted, says to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and got approved. And Far East National Bank was in existence basically for 40 plus years before it got merged out of existence. And, when my father also was responsible for working with various other law firms. He was not an attorney, he was a bank consultant, but he had to bring in attorneys. And, so he was responsible for the creation of Manette Phelps at that particular time, which was a big law firm, and some others that got into the banking practice because he would reach out to them and basically say, here's a project I want you to work on. And over a period of time, my father basically said, I'm tired of kicking this over to other law firms. I says, you're going to law school. We're going to basically do this all internal so we could be kind of a soup to nuts. So I did go to law school. And actually, one of my senior thesis in law school was I wrote a registration statement for a SEC company at that time. It says in a merger transaction.
Okay.
And it was a fascinating project. It says, but who, at 20 years old or 24 years old at that particular time, who is basically doing those kind of things? So I was always in the business. And so when I graduated out of law school in 79 and started my practice, we basically hit the ground running with the organization of banks and working with a number of entities due to the referrals from my father. And that worked out really well. And we worked together for a number of years.
That's awesome.
In addition to those things, we've been publishing the Findley Reports newsletter basically since the early 60s. And I have been writing the newsletter basically for the last 30 plus years. I have to laugh in the sense that I have bankers today that basically said, well, I remember reading the newsletter when your dad wrote it. And when my dad wrote it, it was 4 pages long. Today it's 24 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked them, I said, well, how long ago? It says, do you remember reading it? This was maybe 20 years ago. And I said, well, I've been writing a newsletter basically for 30 years. So they all have a fond memory of all of that. I also want to share one. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you went from your unpaid internship to law school to then not getting credit for being the author for a few years, right? But you got there eventually. So
it was kind of like that. I will tell you that my dad having his office in the garage, it was always fascinating to see who would come and see him. And, can you think about being a 13 or 14-year-old kid and walking in one day and sitting in the garage with my dad? It says next to his desk was Don Drysdale.
Oh, wow.
You mentioned the Dodgers earlier. So this Hall of Fame pitcher basically for the LA Dodgers who was thinking about getting into banking. Okay. And so he came to my father basically to talk through that particular process. And of course, it says I'm jumping up and down. It's Don Drysdale. But at the same time, that was the kind of individual my father was. He had other, he had billionaires in at that time. He also had one of his other clients, basically, he brought Johnny Carson into the banking business, who owned a banking institution for a period of time. So it was kind of always amazing on who would be coming in. And, I was always enamored by what we were able to do with the banking industry. So that's a little bit about my background. Been doing it for a long time.
Well, it's a neat story, and it clearly shows the kind of the dynamics of the business and the fact that, many things can come from that in terms of, taking skill sets and applying them in different ways. And the fact that you ultimately, were able to go through the law school process, but still had your kind of mind and your heart in the banking space is really interesting. So appreciate you sharing that. So let's move to the present tense, right? So, I know you've had a pretty busy schedule this year so far, but what does the remainder of 2023 look like for you and the associations and the network that you're connected with here in California?
Well, 2023 has been an interesting time in the banking industry. We all know that we've had a couple of regional bank failures in California, which has put a significant pressure on a number of our community financial institutions with regard to liquidity and deposits and also cost of fund. And the increase in interest rates with the toughening by the regulatory agencies is influencing the strategic direction of a lot of our institutions. One of the things that we do is a lot of strategic planning. And so I attend a lot of retreats for boards and managements of CFIs in the West United States. And we've already done 4 this year. I've got 5 more. I've got 1 next week that we're going to be doing. And the tenor this year is a little bit different than it has been in the past. Last year, when we were doing these, we were just starting to see the increase in the interest rates, but we had no idea about the impact of the potential failures and the outflow of deposits that would take place due to a flight to safety, I'll call it that, because of Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic Bank.
Sure.
So it's been an interesting time, and so it's influenced how we're advising our boards and managements at this particular time. I'm also going to be facilitating. I think, Neil, you'll probably be at the top banker panel for the California Community Banking Network on November 1 and 2
I
in
will.
La
I'm
Quinta.
excited.
And I've been doing this, facilitating these meetings for them for 10 to 15 years, and really excited about this. We've got 9 what I would consider to be exceptional bankers from banking institutions anywhere from 500 million, which is our smaller panel. It says all the way up to multi-billion. And these are what I refer to as exceptional banks that have demonstrated ongoing performance. And some of the general themes of conversation will be leadership, succession planning, and strategic planning. So we're really excited. It's always a good event. And one of the emphasis when you talk about community banking network, that last word is networking. And
Right.
networking from my perspective is always important, because we want our bankers to talk to each other. And my father basically said, and this is basically 40 years ago, he said, one of the responsibilities of quality management and quality board of directors is to know 5 other quality CEOs or quality directors. And that's not all within your same bank.
Right.
And that we get caught up, this is in the competitive nature too much, and we lose sight about the importance of networking, because we always felt that if you have a problem and you call one of those 5 individuals that you have a lot of respect for, you're going to find answers to your problems, because they will have gone through that type of situation. So we're really big in the networking aspect and excited about the CCBN conference. It's going to be a busy fourth quarter.
Yeah, that's great, and I think that's an awesome philosophy. I personally believe that I'll come to that panel that I'm on with some thoughts, and then I'm sure I'll sit down and have a conversation with a CTO or a CEO or someone else who has their hands in something else, and it might change my opinion on something, right? And that's the beauty of the networking part of it, right? Or just providing that little bit of insider perspective that you wouldn't get if you hadn't otherwise done that. So again, I think that's why we're all very happy that there's. Go ahead.
I agree with you completely. I never come away from those without learning at least a couple of things.
Right.
And that's what's important. We're
Yeah.
always learning.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, and you mentioned it before, so I'm just going to pivot back to something you had said. Obviously it's been a rough year for banks and community banks in general. How are the banks in California, kind of in your jurisdiction, getting along following some of the fallouts of the earlier part of the year? And, what kind of steps do you think they're taking to, I guess, just ensure their customers that things are kind of on track and where they need to be?
Yeah, for the most part, the community banks in the Western United States have done okay. Now, I'm just pulling September 30th information at this time, but on June 30th, it looked actually fairly good, despite the 2 failures that we had. And also, we've had a liquidation with Silvergate in California, too. But through the second quarter of 2022, the financial performance looked pretty good. However, we are anticipating that net income numbers will be falling for the remaining portion of 2023 and also in 2024. We do expect that we're going to have several banking institutions that will have a return on average assets and return on average equity in excess of 1% and 10%, those particular numbers. However, due to the NIM compression and significant increase in the cost of funds that we've recently seen, we do think that the performance numbers are coming down. I will tell you, it says at the top banker panel in 2022, I came up and basically said, my expectation is that I think banking institutions should be generating somewhere in the area of about a 7 to a 9%, a 0.75 to a 0.90 return on average assets, and an 8 to 10% return on average equity. And I had several CEOs step up and say, hey, listen, if I came back to my board of directors and told them I was going to perform that way, then I'd probably lose my job. And so I said, okay, I understand that. Now, we didn't know, it says, that we would have the uptick in interest rates like we had, and we didn't know that we would have the failures that we had, it says, when we came out with that. But we do think, it says, that some of the banking institutions will get the benefit, but when I'm already looking at some third quarter numbers from some of our client banks, I'm starting to see, it says, that number coming down. I'm starting to see some compression with regard to the NIM. And the 4 planning retreats that we've had indicate so far that the numbers are going to come down in 2024 as compared to 2023. So we're educating our boards that it's okay, it says, to make, it says, a 0.8 ROAA. It's okay to make a 8% return on average equity on a going forward basis if we basically can continue that performance on an ongoing basis. I get really concerned, Neil, with the fact it says what I refer to as the picket fence approach, where one moment it says the performance may be 12 or 15%, and the next moment it could be 4 or 5%. And what we're trying to do is look at stability in the performance of these numbers. I do anticipate that we're going to see some banking institutions do very well, but we're also going to see some banking institutions get significantly stressed in the remaining portion of 23 and 2024. The current interest rate environment and where treasuries went during the month of September was not good for purposes of the AOCI that we're going to see that impacts the tangible capital ratios. I will remind you that in the middle of 2022, the FDIC, the state of California, and other regulators were telling boards and managements, do not be concerned about the tangible capital ratios. That's what they basically said. Our focus is on the leverage ratio and the community bank leverage ratios and the like.
Right.
And look at your total risk-based capital ratios. Well, all of a sudden it says, these AOC numbers become significantly negative, and now it is a major focus from the regulatory agencies. So we go from a moment where they say, hey, it's not a concern, to we have several banking institutions in the Western United States who have anywhere from 1/3 to 50% of their shareholder equity identified with a negative AOCI.
Mm-hmm.
And those numbers are significant.
Right.
And we get the pressure from the regulators going forward that this is something that they're going to want to concentrate on.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the thought about kind of the regulatory outlook going forward. But I did want to ask you, and this is just kind of an offshoot. I mean, obviously you provided a lot of really good detailed information around the financials, but I'm curious, from your perspective and the strategic planning sessions you're having, just the conversations in terms of like overall reputation and the risk to that, through this year. Do you feel like that is something that the institutions have been able to kind of reiterate and recover from? Do you feel like that's still an ongoing kind of a risk and a concern in terms of, some of the deposits outflows that you'd mentioned? I mean, is there, again, anecdotally, maybe, anything that you're hearing that could help you kind of, put a little bit of a boundary on that?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting situation. A lot of our community banks are actually very well structured. They have what I refer to as a fortress type balance sheet, something to withstand the ups and downs of the regulatory environment or the economy.
Right.
And so they've got an earning engine there. And unfortunately, that because of the media hype or the regulatory focus or whatever, we've got this concentration that says on safety and soundness. And most of our banking institutions are actually extremely well capitalized. They've got a strong balance sheet. They've got a strong income statement going forward. They have great connection with their customers, which I think are all critical to them going forward. What we're telling our banks in 2024 is, let's don't do anything stupid. Let's continue, it says, to build the fortress type balance sheet, know our customers, have a stable income statement, at the same time as basically communicating the vision and direction of your institution and why you are a safe and sound entity. Fortunately, our community banks don't have the same type of short sale impact. It says, or, when you look at First Republic and you look at Silicon Valley, you look at a flawed model that if you look at it for an extended period of time, you knew that there was some significant risk in there. And most of our CFIs don't have that, which is extremely, it's a good thing in today's marketplace. And I think that's one of the reasons that the regulatory agencies are fairly comfortable with regard to what some of these CFIs and how they look at this time. So I'm actually kind of pleased this is what I'm seeing. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we don't have some weaknesses, and we do have some banks out there that have made some stupid decisions in the sense that they put a significant amount of their investments in low yielding treasuries or whatever it is that's impacted their ability going forward. And we do have some institutions that have actually gone out and bid high cost of funds which is impacting their balance sheet. So what they've done is they move from asset sensitive to liability sensitive, and these changes in interest rates are going to have a dramatic impact on them.
Right. And I asked the question too, because I wonder a little bit in terms of how it hurts them from a customer, or potentially hurts them from a customer acquisition standpoint, right? Depending on some of their goals there. But it would appear that, the ones that were kind of doing it right have always done it right. And, they'll just be able to communicate their kind of safe and sound, principles and visions a little bit better. It seems like overall that was maybe an opportunity missed that now becomes part of like a regular communication stream, right? So I'm just, kind of curious, are you seeing that? Does that sound right? Does that, does that foot for you?
It does. One of the things that, because of the media hype involving Silicon and First Republic and the industry itself, we had this move of flight to safety. So they would go into the major banks or those that were too big to fail. And also we had a lot of movement in our banks to interfi, or moving some of the uninsured deposits into other off-balance sheet items that would help the clientele. What we're now experiencing, and this is something that's come up at a couple of the retreats, is that the flight that took place earlier this year, the banks didn't lose the deposit relationship. It just basically, it says it condensed down from a standpoint, instead of having $1 million on deposit, they had 500,000 on deposit. But what we're now starting to see is that moving to the big banks and going into transactions or going to the brokerage accounts or whatever, they don't get the same level of service. It's just a rate type of situation.
Right.
And we think that they are going to start coming back, it says, to the banking institution because of this consultative process of working closely between the banks and the business customers. And most of our CFIs, they're not retail. These are banking institutions that are really tied, it says, to the business customer.
Right. Makes sense. And I'm sure they're working, based on kind of their strategies and segmentation to bring those folks back with some strong value prop and messaging and things of that nature. So it's probably some good stuff. Well, so let's turn and look ahead a little bit, right? So, I mean, obviously, I think you've done a really nice job of sort of recapping and recounting what you've seen in 2023. I mean, when you look at 2024, you look at beyond 2024, what's your kind of thought, prediction, vision for, performance in general? What does that look like to you?
Well, if you can define what higher for longer means, my expectation is that we're going to be in this interest rate environment, probably it says through 24, 25, and then maybe at the end of 25, early 26.
Right.
And so what if boards and managements are really wanting to be here for the long term, then frankly, okay, let's move down our expectations of double-digit return on average equity. Let's go down to somewhere in the area, says, of 6 to 8% return, and continue to build the strength of the balance sheet going forward. Because I think when the market does turn, that will be a benefit for these banking institutions. We also know that community banks can navigate very well in a time of economic turmoil. Now, again, we're always concerned, it says, about money going out the back door through loan losses. I'll address that in a minute. But for the most part, our banking institutions, if they set the right expectations and they don't get greedy, then frankly, that I think is going to be the secret sauce, basically, this is for 24, 25. Are they going to be making double-digit returns? No. Should they basically make high single-digit returns? I think that's possible, and that's really where the focus needs to be. We need to basically remain strong and build to play for another day. Yeah. I did mention too, is that we're starting to see some weaknesses in credit. For the most part, we are telling our banking institutions to get very close to their customers to understand what is happening on with their businesses. Fortunately, most of our CFIs don't have a significant concentration in offices in metropolitan areas or big box stores or the like. So we're feeling fairly comfortable. The commercial real estate concentration is going to be an issue for these institutions because that's really been the bread and butter for most of our CFIs. And most of them basically have a CRE concentration well in excess of 300%. But when you think about, that law, that regulation came into place in 2006, and what we had with the Great Recession, our bankers are smarter. So they've learned how to make credit and spread it a little bit differently. They don't have the same kind of risk profile that they had before. So even though that they may be above those limits and have to justify it to the regulatory agencies, I think for the most part they'll be doing pretty well in 24 and 25, unless we have a major collapse.
Right.
But I'm not seeing that right now. I think we're going to have some form of recession. You call it whatever you want to. But I think our banks need to figure that this is not a time to get to be stupid or grow excessively. It's a time basically to stick with the fundamentals.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And you scratched the surface a little bit about the regulators. I mean, what's the outlook from a regulatory standpoint for California banks after this year? What do you think is going to concern them most going forward, given some of the things that happened this year and just trying to anticipate that, kind of what comes next?
I think that it breaks down into a couple of areas. One, of course, they're always concerned about cyber and what is happening on that, the technology-related aspects, and AI. Those are things that I think boards need to be thinking about and have robust systems in place, especially with regard to cyber, because that can turn things fairly quickly. I do think that liquidity will have an impact on how they are looking at banks doing their stress testing going forward. I think our banks have done a very good job of stress testing their deposits as well as their capital and also their loan portfolios going forward. So that has meant something positive to them. I expect that the regulators are also looking at succession planning. What are we doing within our institutions to continue to build the bench depth? With what we went through with the pandemic and the work from home, I do think that a lot of our institutions don't have extremely deep benches. I look at the regulatory agencies too. They don't have deep benches right now either, from a standpoint of
Right.
people that have been around for a period of time. So I think we're going to be finding our way. I am generally pleased, though, with both the FDIC, with the FDIC, the OCC, the Fed, and the DFPI in California to listen to our banking institutions. I recently had an opportunity to do a planning retreat with the former regional director for the FDIC, who retired a month ago. And it was her focus was similar to, stick to the fundamentals, know your banking institution, don't do something stupid, communicate with your regulatory agencies. Liquidity is going to be extremely important going forward. But she was actually quite optimistic that the large majority of banking institutions will be able to navigate through this because they have put the work in. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's important.
And do you feel like they're, still friendly to the idea of innovation in terms of the regulatory side of things?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do think that they're friendly to the idea of innovation, but with the caveat to boards and managements, do your due diligence and be certain it says that innovation isn't all things to all people. Right. I look at what's come out on some of the fintech type of entities, and a lot of the banks that got into fintech related matters actually ended up with some type of enforcement action. And because they didn't have the systems and controls in place and didn't fully understand it, or, they got ahead of their skis. And frankly, I think that the regulators, because of this economic uncertainty, it says are going to want our banks to be more conservative as compared, it says, to being extremely aggressive on business models. I also think that this communication with the regulators is going to be extremely important because to implement these plans is going to take a period of time. Those boards that think they can get into fintech or get into some kind of innovation and it's a solution for everything better have strong communications with the regulators and think about the advantages and disadvantages, because right. A misstep in this area could have a significant negative consequence on the bank on a going forward basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's always the balance, right? But it sounds like there's some open dialogue there and some opportunities. So that's great. It's wild, right? Think about it. I mean, going from the COVID times through to a situation like we had earlier this year. I mean, bankers have been working hard, right? I mean, I have to imagine when you speak to folks and both in the executive teams and the boards, like I have to imagine they're tired, right? They've been putting in quite a shift. I mean, how does it feel to be like in their shoes? It must be a challenging time still.
It is a challenging time, and actually, I have to compliment our boards and managements for putting in the time and working through this. And they are tired. The regulators are tired. I'm tired. It's just like we have something going through all the time. But that doesn't mean that we can stop. We have to continue to, as I usually tell my boards, we've got to keep our head down and keep swimming.
Right.
And 10 years, or 7 or 8 years ago, there was always an opportunity for somebody to acquire another bank. So when you got tired, you could basically, maybe find somebody who could acquire you,
Right.
which is, one of the reasons that a lot of our banks have merged out of existence. However, because of where bank stocks are at this moment in time, where the mark to market is on a balance sheet, which would create a significant amount of goodwill, we don't see a lot of M&A activity at this moment in time. We see a few deals, but
Right.
not a lot of M&A activity. So that means it says if we're going to be down this through 23, 24, maybe into 25, well, guys, suck it up. We gotta work through being tired, but that also means that we've got to think about succession planning,
Mm-hmm.
building our teams, having the right human capital within our organizations going forward, and not doing anything stupid. What we normally find is that what causes our banks to become extremely tired is that they move away from the fundamentals and do something stupid, or they
Right.
try to get into a new endeavor
Right.
that may not work out. That sucks a lot of energy. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're saying batten down the hatches, stick to the fundamentals, and you should be able to make a good return. Good return, not a great return, a good return over the next couple of years.
I'm intrigued by the topic of succession planning a bit, and just wanted to ask you maybe one follow up question on that, Gary, which is, do you feel like the higher education system in California is doing the right? Like, what are the opportunities there to create a better pipeline over time? I'm just curious because I'm sure you're having these conversations and planning sessions. Any kind of macro items that come up time and time again around that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Back when I started, you could look back at Bank of America, Security Pacific Bank at that time, First Interstate Bank. A lot of these major banks had executive training programs,
Right.
and a lot of our CEOs of community banks actually got into that and basically went through the training process and eventually became CEOs of banking institutions. Unfortunately, the major banks and even the regional banks have moved away from that. So we don't have larger banking institutions providing that educational or training system for our management. So that means our individual banking institutions need to basically create their own human capital or training systems to build from within. And I'm one of those who believes that we have to be creative on how we look at management and board members going forward. When I look at a banking institution and management, sure, I'd like to have somebody with experience in the banking environment, but what I'd rather I'd love to have somebody who's eager, who's humble, hungry, and smart, who's really focused in on learning and can do a job. And we've already seen instances where we've had CEOs who have not come up through the banking system be extremely successful, but they're disciplined and they're willing to put the work in. And I suspect that especially some of our banks that are now wanting to be around legacy banks, they got to put more money into training their people and building that organization from within. One other thing that concerns me a little bit is especially culture, culture in these banking institutions. And where we tell a lot of our banks that be careful about bringing somebody from outside into your banking institution and giving them the keys to the bank until you're comfortable it says that they've adapted your culture. And so that's what something that's important from my perspective is that let's be certain this is that we've got the right type of individual who understands the culture of the banking institution and can lead the organization going forward. I do think we've got some, these 9 bankers that are going to be on the top banker panels,
Mm-hmm.
are what I call exceptional leaders. And so those are the type of individuals that are always looking, not from just from a standpoint, it says of their job, but they're saying, what can I do to help those people within my organization and build my pipeline, or build my bench going forward? That I think is extremely.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting conversation and something that, I mean, frankly, I think every industry is managing to some degree, right? But obviously, in the banking industry, given some beliefs that, and it was funny. I was actually having a conversation with one of our international board members the other day, and this came up around the topic of, does a bank CEO have to be someone who came up only through finance, or could it be someone that was in operations, or someone that was on the marketing side, right? Like there's all these kind of questions. Sometimes there's sort of a preconceived formula, right? But I think, what you're hitting on is that, the humble, the hungry, the smart, plus the culture fit, right? As well as time exposed to, what really needs to be understood and done, can be, a dynamic personality. It doesn't always have to be the same archetype, if you will, right? So it's an interesting thing, and something that, as you started talking about it, spurred a follow-up question. So I appreciate you tackling that one. And it's probably a good segue into my next question, which is around the California Community Banking Network, trying to understand a little bit about the charter there. Obviously, the team at SRM is very excited to be a preferred partner now of the California Community Banking Network. And I was hoping you could share a little bit about the mission of the organization, your role there, and just, some of the things that are happening at the CCBN.
Well, we're very appreciative of you guys being part of CCBN, and we're excited about this partnership going forward. Our focus is primarily, and again, CCBN is affiliated to a certain extent with ICBA, so we have some kind of connection with there, and they've been a good resource for us on a going forward basis. But this has been around for a number of years, and frankly, we have 3 pillars. One is basically advocacy. So we do communicate out to all of our banking institutions what's going on in California, in Sacramento, what's going on back in Washington, D.C., what's going on with the regulatory agencies, and what do we need to be thinking about on how that impacts the community financial institutions. The second basically is education. And we're very interested in continuing to have educational programs that are tied to things that for our bankers and our board members. So we're always doing 2 sessions. The 2 sessions I'm really involved in are the top banker panel and the directors roundtable that we do earlier in the year. But CCBN has educational programs all the time. In fact, they just did an Innovate session a little while back, and a day with the regulators, all designed basically to get information and start communicating about issues and challenges for our community financial institutions. The third element, which I talked about earlier, was networking. That's the third leg of the stool. And what we want to do is to serve as a mechanism by which to bring bankers and board members together. And we feel that, 2 heads are better than 1, 5 heads are better than 4. The more that we can get bankers in the room talking, the better off we're going to be. This is with regard to the industry. And I'm not one who believes, for our community banks, another community bank is not their competitor. It may have been 20 years ago, but it isn't today. Their competitors are the major banks, the regional banks, and then also basically brokerage firms and non-banking institutions. And so, we can work as a collective as is to help all of our banking institutions. And CCBN is really focused in on basically CFIs, and not necessarily, it says, on the regional banks or basically the major banking institutions. We're a little bit different than there's the California Bankers Association, which we think is a good organization too, but they had primarily been focused in on the major banking institutions who have funded them for an extended period of time. We're basically for the little guys.
Sure.
Little guys, $5 billion or below.
Makes sense. And it sounds like, we talked a little bit about succession planning. I think there's some education that will ultimately impact that, and the networking piece obviously is invaluable. So that's fantastic. We've covered a lot of stuff today here, Gary, and I appreciate you again, helping us from kind of the backstory up to, just managing, some of the challenges that are out there and the work you're doing with your clients and, through the CCBN. But I guess I have to ask you one last question, which is, are you still bullish on the future of independent banking sector and community banks, given, the proper planning and investments? What does your mind tell you there?
Well, I am bullish. I'm bullish basically for the industry itself. I do think that there's a continued role for community financial institutions for an extended period of time. And so I'm good about that. And I'm a shareholder of a lot of banking institutions. In fact, I've always believed that I should be a shareholder of all the banking institutions that I represent, because I need to have skin in the game.
Mm-hmm.
That's important from my perspective. That I want to feel the pain as a shareholder or the joy of a shareholder, just like the board members and the management teams going forward. So I'm bullish about that. Now, am I happy with regard to what my portfolio looks like today? No, I'm not. But that's the marketplace. And but I do think we've got potential upside. But I'm a long-term investor. I'm not a short-term investor. And so I'm really looking at where this industry is headed. And my expectations, for my portfolio is if I can do a 5 to 8% return, that's fantastic. Sure, I'll have some ones that are spectacular, 15, 20, 30%. That's fine. But it says I don't want to be greedy. I really want to focus in on having the right blend of it, and basically be supportive of an industry that I love, my father loved, and frankly, we're going to continue to support for as long as we can. Neil, I wanted to add one other thing too, and I'm sorry to digress here for a second. It's okay.
No, I love it.
One of I do in my strategic planning meetings, I basically talk about some general themes. I talked earlier about humble, hungry, and smart, which is out of a Patrick Lencioni book, and then we've got other things going forward. But one of my general themes that I talk about, of course, asking boards is, why are you here? What is relevant to you guys? But there are 4 what I call virtues that I'm now starting to talk about. And those 4 virtues are conditioning, accessibility, versatility, and belief. Do you know where those come from?
I don't, but I probably should. So you're going to stump me here.
Well, do you watch Ted Lasso?
I do indeed. Yeah.
Those are the 4.
Yeah, I had a feeling I should have known that answer, but I like it.
And candidly, we keep telling our boards, conditioning means basically both mental and physical conditioning.
Sure.
Accessibility, meaning or awareness, is really critical. Versatility is important. Belief, and we also want our banks and board members to believe in the direction and the mission and the vision of where they're taking their institutions. And if they have those virtues, we think they can be successful.
I like that. And I like that you ended it with belief, because I think that's what that last question is really all about, is believing in an industry that's got plenty of history and plenty of, runway ahead of it to do the right things, with that combo of the fortress balance sheet that you've mentioned. And, obviously still trying to work with regulators, have open conversations, network with, their own community, right? So that it's not necessarily looked at as a competitive structure, but really a way for, those parties to learn from each other and build something great. So that's really cool. I can't thank you enough for joining me here today, sharing your backstory, your expertise with our listeners. I think this is going to be a good one. I think people will have picked up a number of nuggets of wisdom here. The virtues were great as an ending point, so appreciate you sharing those. And of course, I would encourage our listeners to check out the content on FindleyReports.com, Findley-reports.com, to be clear, FINDLEY-REPORTS.com. And that includes the banking newsletter, and you'll get some unique perspectives from Gary on building a better board of directors as well on the site. So there's a lot of good stuff there. And Gary, is there anything else that we should be pointing folks towards in terms of, getting connected with you or any of the content that's out there?
Well, Neil, again, thank you for the opportunity to be on this podcast. I'm always interested in talking with bankers or directors or professionals about the industry. It's an area of passion for me. So feel free to reach out. Happy to talk, give ideas. Neil, I'm really looking forward to seeing you on November 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a good conference, and we're always excited to have bankers in the room.
Very, very much looking forward to it myself. And hopefully the bankers that we speak with will be open to some of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about, since they may be a little further fetched than what they're doing today when we're talking about the metaverse and some other future forward kind of technology type stuff. But really looking forward to it as well. Gary, this was awesome. Thanks so much for joining me again. Thank you to our listeners for checking out this episode of the Firmer Ground podcast. And Gary, I hope we get to talk to you again soon. And I hope things continue to improve, and looking forward to seeing your banking partners putting those virtues into place. I think there's a lot of great stuff there. So thanks again, Gary. Appreciate you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Firmer Ground from SRM. Please stay tuned for our upcoming podcasts. And until then, you can visit us at srmcorp.com or on LinkedIn and Twitter.